By the direction of the Committee on the Judiciary, I call up House Report 118-527.
The clerk will report the title of the report.
Report to accompany House Resolution 1292, resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find United States Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Committee on the Judiciary.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 1287, the report is considered read. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, seek recognition?
Committee on the Judiciary, I call up House Resolution 1292 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 1292, resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find United States Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Committee on the Judiciary.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1287, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designee. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. On page 1 of his report, Special Counsel Hur said President Biden, quote, willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. Joe Biden not only kept information he wasn't allowed to keep, he shared it with people who weren't allowed to get it. And on page 231, the special counsel told us why President Biden did this. He said, quote, President Biden had strong motivations to ignore proper procedures for safeguarding the classified information in his notebooks. He had decided months before leaving office to write a book for which he got paid $8 million. So we have motive. An $8 million motive. We have the elements of the crime: knowingly keeping classified information, knowingly disclosing classified information. But despite all this, Special Counsel Hur declined to recommend prosecution for President Biden because Joe Biden is, quote, a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. On page 207 of his report, Special Counsel Hur said Mr. Biden's memory also appeared to have significant limitations, both at the time he spoke to the ghostwriter, Mr. Zwanitzer, in 2017, as evidenced by their recorded conversations, and today as evidenced by his recorded interview with our office. The committees need the audio recordings to determine whether the Justice Department appropriately carried out justice by not prosecuting the president. Because remember what they told us. Justice Department said, we're going to operate independent of the White House. They said, we'll be impartial, independent arbiters of the facts. Okay, maybe so, but what we do know is this. One former president's being charged, Joe Biden's not being. We think we're entitled, actually, we know we're entitled to all the evidence and the best evidence. And the transcripts alone are not sufficient evidence of the state of the president's memory, especially since the executive branch has a history of changing transcripts. We saw this in late April. The transcript the White House put out didn't match the video and audio recording of President Biden's speech. And only after the White House was caught did they change the transcript. And in that case, and in this case, the audio recording is the best evidence of the words that President Biden actually spoke. Following the release of Special Counsel Hur's report, both the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committees issued subpoenas requiring Attorney General Garland to turn over the transcripts of the audio recordings of Special Counsel Hur's interviews with President Biden and his ghostwriter. To date, the Attorney General has failed to produce those recordings. In fact, he told us last week he wasn't going to do it, and that is why we're here. Despite the committee's best efforts, the department has continued to withhold the audio recordings of those interviews without providing any constitutional or legal basis to do so. Just hours before the committee was set to meet and consider the contempt resolution, the department notified the committee that President Biden had asserted, at the Attorney General's urging, executive privilege over the audio recordings. It's simple. Attorney General Garland holds information vital to the committee's legislative oversight and the House impeachment inquiry. Remember, this body voted December 13th of last year to enter that phase of our oversight duty and impeachment inquiry. The Department has a legal obligation to turn over the requested material. Attorney General Garland's willful refusal to constitutes contempt of Congress. This resolution upholds the institutional power of the House by recommending that the House find Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for failing to comply with the committee's subpoena. Our oversight and impeachment responsibilities are too important to allow the Attorney General to willfully disregard this. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and we reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. But first, the gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the dishonesty that we have just heard is illustrated by what Mr. Jordan just said. His selective quote from Mr. Herr's report. He said, "Our investigation uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen." The report does say that. But he neglects a sentence, a paragraph later. However, for the reasons summarized below, we conclude that the evidence does not establish Mr. Biden's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is deceptive. Secondly, as the majority well knows, the President asserted executive privilege in this matter. Maybe that was proper, maybe not, but the way to contest executive privilege is not by a contempt resolution, it's by going to court and letting the court decide whether the exercise of executive privilege is warranted or not, and for that reason also, this resolution fails. Mr. Speaker, the Judiciary Committee under Republican control has spent the last 18 months and $20 million taxpayer dollars in a desperate search to find something, anything, that they can use to damage President Biden and to protect Donald Trump. Other committees have gotten into the act as well, spending untold taxpayer money not to benefit the American people, not to feed hungry children, not to address our housing crisis, and not to improve our health care system, but on a single-minded quest to follow every right-wing conspiracy theory in the vain hope that it might lead to some evidence of wrongdoing. And what exactly have they delivered to the American people on their investment? Nothing. No evidence that the conspiracies are true, no indictments, no impeachment, no wins of any significance. And the Republican leadership knows that if they don't come up with something to show for the millions of dollars they have spent, the MAGA political base may stay home next November. So they are scrambling in a desperate attempt to look like they have accomplished something. They were fervently hoping that Special Counsel Hur would indict President Biden for mishandling classified documents so that they could attack President Biden and misdirect the American people away from Donald Trump's treacherous handling of classified information. But the Special Counsel cleared Mr. Biden of wrongdoing for reasons that have nothing to do with Mr. Hur's gratuitous and widely contradicted comments about the President's memory. So what do our Republican friends do when an investigation turns up short? Simply put, they engage in fantasy. That's what they are doing here today. Unable to come up with any wrongdoing by the President, they have now trained their sights on the Attorney General. They accuse him of withholding key evidence, but the Attorney General has substantially complied with their every request. Sometimes he has been too responsive, in my opinion, given the obvious bad faith of the MAGA majority. DOJ has produced 92,000 pages of documents since Republicans took control of the House last year, and has made dozens of witnesses available for interviews, hearings, and briefings. That's more pages of documents and more witnesses than the Trump Justice Department produced to Congress in 4 years. Just last week, the Attorney General himself spent more than 5 hours testifying before the Judiciary Committee. With respect to the subpoena at issue in this contempt resolution, the Department turned over all the information Republicans asked for. There's been no obstruction, only cooperation. In reality, the Attorney General and DOJ have been fully responsive to Congress in every way that might be material to their long-dead impeachment inquiry. All that remains are audio files to which the President has asserted executive privilege. In a letter to Chairman Jordan and Comer, the Department of Justice noted that producing the audio recordings would, quote, raise an unacceptable risk of undermining the Department's ability to conduct high-profile criminal investigations, in particular with investigations where the voluntary cooperation of the White House officials is exceedingly important, close quote. The chairman claimed that they need those records to understand the pauses, pace, and tone of the conversation. This is absurd and clearly pretextual, and in any event, it does not outweigh the substantial concerns expressed by the President and the Department. Moreover, with respect to the recording at issue in this report, a complete certified transcript has already been provided to both committees. And no credible allegation has been made that these transcripts have been altered in any material way. The only thing that has not been produced is the recording itself, something that in the wrong hands can be easily manipulated. That is not an idle concern. Deepfakes and misleadingly edited videos and recordings have proliferated in recent years. Last year, a witness testifying in a closed-door deposition told us that she was the victim of a manipulated video made by a third party but shared widely by the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, who refused to take down the video even after it was abundantly clear that it was manipulated. That video contributed to a flood of death threats against the witness. This isn't really about a policy disagreement with the DOJ. This is about feeding the MAGA base after 18 months of investigations that have produced failure after failure. Like most of the bills House Republicans have pushed on purely partisan lines, this contempt resolution will do very little, other than smear the reputation of Merrick Garland, who will remain a good and decent public servant no matter what Republicans say about him today. This resolution may boost Donald Trump's spirits before his sentencing, but it will almost certainly not convince the Department of Justice to produce the one remaining file in question. Like the broader impeachment effort before it, this contempt resolution will have been a partisan stunt, destined to fail from the very start. And as I said before, if they were really interested in getting this recording, they would contest the assertion of executive privilege in court, not bring a contempt resolution against the Attorney General. The American people actually need us to do important work. I'm tired of these games, and so are the American people. I urge my colleagues to oppose this measure, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, good friend from the great state of Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
The gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman from Ohio for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the resolution. This is not a complicated matter. The Oversight and Judiciary Committees issued duly authorized legal subpoenas to Attorney General Garland for a certain set of documents, including the audio recordings of Special Counsel Hur's interview with President Biden. The Attorney General has refused to produce these audio recordings. Unlike what my Democratic colleagues keep claiming, this is not just Republicans who need these recordings for their oversight duties. Media outlets, including the AP, CBS, CNN, NBC, and the Washington Post, among others, have filed suit to get these same audio recordings as well. Because the media, like everyone else, knows there's no substitute for a recording of an interview. Not a transcript, not a summary, not the Attorney General's judgment that Congress doesn't need it. The Oversight Committee's investigation of these classified documents has already revealed that the White House's official timeline of events regarding these classified materials left out very important details. For instance, White House employees were entering the Penn Biden Center and moving documents months before the discovery of the classified materials by President Biden's personal attorneys in November 2022. One of those employees was former White House counsel Dana Remus. We issued a subpoena for Mrs. Remus's deposition, but the White House has blocked Mrs. Remus from speaking to the Oversight Committee. The White House has also blocked other White House employees who visited the Penn Biden Center before November 2022 from speaking to us. What is the Biden administration trying to hide? Attorney General Merrick Garland's refusal to produce this evidence establishes a clear pattern of obstruction by the DOJ to cover up President Biden's wrongdoing. President Biden has lied to the American people about his mishandling of classified documents. He has repeatedly denied not knowing about or being involved in his family's influence peddling schemes, which the Oversight Committee can now show has raked in $18 million from foreign individuals and entities for the Biden family members, including President Biden himself. He also met with nearly all his family's foreign associates. President Biden's Department of Justice appears to be taking every step to insulate him from the consequences, whether it's hiding these audio recordings or attempting to give Hunter Biden a sweetheart plea deal to shield Joe Biden from facing accountability for his role in his family's influence peddling schemes. This is unacceptable. The House of Representatives cannot serve as a necessary check on the presidency if the executive branch is free to ignore the House's subpoenas. I urge my colleagues to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 5 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Oversight and Investigations Committee, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Speaker. Our colleagues invite us today to become the first Congress in the history of the United States to hold someone in contempt for complying with our demands. And their target is the Attorney General of the United States. Attorney General Garland gave us the special counsel's report on President Biden in full. He made the special counsel available to us in committee for hours of testimony where he answered all our questions, and he provided the full transcript of the president's voluntary 5-hour interview with the special counsel, all 250 pages of it. The whole world can read President Biden's interview and his answers unedited. But that's apparently not enough. Now they want to hold the Attorney General in contempt for not turning over the audio tape of the interview that we have the verbatim transcript of. And why is that important? Well, in case you've lost the thread of this madcap wild goose chase, America, remember this is an impeachment investigation. Do they think that the holy grail of the 118th Congress, evidence of a presidential high crime and misdemeanor, is lurking in the pauses or the background throat clearings and sneezes on the audio tape? Well, of course not. They know there's no high crime or misdemeanor to be found because they've spent the last 17 months and millions of our taxpayer dollars looking for it, and it simply does not exist. They literally don't even know what they're looking for anymore. So why do they want it? Well, they're hoping that in the 5 hours of President Biden's testimony, they can find a mispronounced word or phrase or a brief stammer, which they can then turn into an embarrassing political TV attack ad. Get it, America? That's what this is all about. And holding the Attorney General of the United States in contempt is one more useful distraction from the complete and devastating implosion of the Biden impeachment probe, which of course was the #1 priority of these talented leaders. Remember, they promised to reveal the greatest presidential high crime and misdemeanor in American history, an act of treachery and deceit that dwarfs even the incitement of a violent mob insurrection and an attempted political coup that took place right here against our Constitution, our Congress, our Vice President, in this chamber. But after their truly prodigious investigation, punctuated, admittedly, by some unfortunate mishaps like Chinese spies, fake evidence, pornographic displays in committee, and their own witnesses testifying that there were no grounds for presidential impeachment, they have nothing to show for their arduous work other than one more debunked Russian disinformation operation and one more indicted GOP informant and star witness. Rather than admit defeat in this bumbling operation and look for some other way to actually aid the public good, they've decided to flail about in mock outrage against a series of phantom tyrants in the hopes of distracting everyone from this epic flop. Their first distraction was to impeach Secretary Ali Mayorkas as a paltry consolation prize, but that pathetic decoy action blew up in their hands. Then the plan was to skip the mundane work of casting votes and actually doing committee business to travel on a collective spiritual pilgrimage on Amtrak to New York City to attend the criminal trial of an unmentionable American felon, one of 19 million in the country. But that strange journey to Mecca also blew up in their faces when this mystery political false prophet was convicted unanimously by a jury of his peers on dozens of felony criminal counts in a fair American trial. They tried to salvage the credibility of this bizarre expedition by blaming the American justice system for being weaponized against Republicans. But this political extremism quickly melted away when the son of President Biden, the original target of their wrath, was also prosecuted and convicted, like another disarmed felon whose name may now not be spoken on the floor, apparently, by a unanimous jury of his peers on all counts against him. And that trial, unlike the trial whose very existence must be sent down the Orwellian memory hole to save someone hurt feelings, was actually tried in the federal system. So what's left to do now? Well, let's hold the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, in contempt, of course. This will be sure to placate an unrepentant and anonymous convicted felon from New York and distract everybody else for a day or two. I confess it's a bit rich, Mr. Speaker, to be asked to hold the Attorney General of the United States in contempt of Congress for overwhelmingly complying with the committee's demands by members who voted against contempt citations for Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro, two persons subpoenaed by the January 6th Select Committee who never spent a single minute. Could I have one more?
The gentleman's time has expired.
I grant the gentleman an additional minute.
Bannon and Navarro never spent a minute with the January 6th committee, never turned over a single document to our committee. These people had 0% compliance with Congress. They demonstrated true contempt, which is why they've been sentenced to jail. But Chairman Comer, in his wisdom, would hold the Attorney General of the United States of America in contempt for what I think is 100% compliance, but in any event is something like 98 or 99% compliance. If you think a federal official has not rendered proper compliance, you take them to court, you don't hold them in contempt, and it's rich beyond measure, like a billionaire rich, to be asked to hold the Attorney General in contempt by people who themselves received subpoenas to testify before the January 6th committee, who never rendered a single document nor a single minute of testimony to the January 6th committee. I urge Congress to reject this absurd motion, and I'm happy to yield back to the chairman.
The chair would remind members to refrain from engaging in personalities toward presumptive nominees for the office of president. Recognize the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I never said I wouldn't testify in front of the January 6th committee. I just want to know what the parameters of that testimony were going to be. So I never did say no to that. Second, the speaker before just said we don't know what we're looking for. We're looking for equal treatment under the law. Special Counsel Hur found Joe Biden knowingly kept classified information. Joe Biden knowingly disclosed classified information. He told us that on the very first page of his report. And then he told us later why he did so. He said he had strong motivation for ignoring classified procedures because he was writing a book for which he got paid $8 million. Again, we have motive, and we have him knowingly disclosing classified information. But he doesn't get charged. Yet President Trump does. President Trump does by Jack Smith. Jack Smith, the guy who had to file with the court a notice saying that he actually altered the order of the documents he seized on the raid of the president's home. He had to tell the court that. The physical documents don't match up with the scanned documents. You're not allowed to change the sequence of the documents you seized. But Jack Smith did. Jack Smith mishandled the documents he's accusing President Trump of mishandling. You can't make this stuff up. That's what we're focused on. And, oh, by the way, we're in the midst of an impeachment inquiry. We're entitled to the best evidence. That's why we want the audio tape. With that, I yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the crime subcommittee, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. You know, during his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, Special Counsel Hur stated that, quote, the evidence and the president himself put his memory squarely at issue, close quote. In his report, Special Counsel Hur noted that during both his and Zwanitzer's interviews with President Biden, the president's memory was significantly limited. President Biden has contested that. The Democrats contest that. But in reality, it's the failure to fully comply with the committee's subpoenas regarding the audio recordings of the Biden and Zwonitzer interviews that has hindered the House's ability to adequately conduct oversight over Special Counsel Hur regarding his investigative findings and the President's retention and disclosure of classified materials, and has impeded the committee's impeachment inquiry. So, the committee must assess whether the Special Counsel Hur's declination decision, which was based on President Biden's poor mental state, was consistent with the Department's commitment to impartial justice, or whether legislative reforms are necessary regarding special counsel investigations because they are not leading to impartial outcomes. In short, the audio recordings would offer unique and important information to advance the committee's impeachment inquiry and inform the Judiciary Committee as to the need for legislative reforms to the operations of the Department or the conduct of special counsel investigations. Those are legislative purposes, they are constitutional purposes, and they justify us getting the audio recordings. But they don't want the audio recordings to come forward. Why is that? It's odd, isn't it? Because the DOJ admitted in court filings 2 weeks ago that they actually did alter the transcript. They claim, oh, there's just filler information. Maybe there were duplicative words. There were blank pauses in there that were not noted in the transcript. That's why an audio recording is important, because the transcripts do not reflect important verbal context, such as tone or tenor, or nonverbal context, such as pauses or pace of delivery, all of which went into the decision by Mr. Hur not to prosecute a crime that he said was committed. That prosecutorial discretion is under review by our committee legitimately and constitutionally. We have the right to that audio recording. The department has said they're not going to give it to us. Odd. Because the cases that deal with requiring the audio recording to be turned over, the long skein of cases, they turn on various things like the audio recording is the best evidence. They say that. Odd. They also say that if there's tampering or any kind of editing or altering of the written transcript, which we now know is true, then the audio recording is mandatory. That's why we should get it. This department won't give it to us. Merrick Garland is in contempt of this Congress, and he needs to be held in contempt. And with that, I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging personalities toward the President. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
I reserve.
Chairman reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is absurd. This is Fellini in the Congress. Comparing what Joe Biden did to what the other fellow that preceded him in office did in keeping documents in Mar-a-Lago in his bathroom and out in the fancy rooms where all of his billionaire friends go, is like comparing somebody that writes a bad check by $2, an overdraft, to somebody who's a bank robber with guns and weapons and machine guns going into banks and robbing money. Biden was a sympathetic figure, said Mr. Hur, a Republican who Merrick Garland gave the duty to study that case. He was a sympathetic figure. You don't commit a crime unless there is guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Hur found there could not be guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. What the other fellow did, refusing to comply with requests to give the documents, classified documents up, refusing and then having to have a search warrant and finding them, hundreds of documents. Not for the purpose of writing a book, for somebody who can't even read a book, but for purposes that we don't know and what they were used for, but they were taken illegally and improperly. Merrick Garland is an honorable and good man who should be in the College of Cardinals and not being tried for contempt by this Fellini-esque.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, sir. I have not seen a more diligent and honorable Attorney General in the times I've served in Congress. Merrick Garland is a superb individual, And this is just projection, trying to throw things off from the other fella, Trump, and put them on Biden. There's no comparison. Once again, it's like comparing a bank robber to a guy that wrote an overdraft. I yield back the balance of my time.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Before recognizing Mr. Bishop, let me, the chair would remind members again to refrain from engaging personalities toward presumptive nominees for the office of president. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman from California. This matter is simple, and in its simplicity is the clarity of its appropriate resolution. The audio recording of President Biden's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur is demeanor evidence. Demeanor is one's outward manner, a way of conducting oneself, one might say, is bearing. And in some circumstances, demeanor evidence is the most probative, powerful evidence that can be heard. Better than words, it can evidence credibility or evasiveness and avoidance. And especially in this circumstance, it can evidence a witness's capacities to observe, recall, and relate information accurately. President Biden shared classified information with his ghostwriter in pursuance of securing his $3 million book advance. Mr. Hur attributed the Justice Department's decision not to recommend prosecution of President Biden for misusing, mishandling classified documents on this and other occasions to the facts that he is an elderly man with poor memory. A raw transcript doesn't inform the Judiciary Committee sufficiently to evaluate the reasonableness of that determination, especially since President Biden hotly contested Special Counsel Hur's characterization. Demeanor evidence could powerfully clarify whether that exercise of prosecutorial discretion was politically neutral or politically freighted. In fact, it is the very power of the demeanor evidence in the audio of Biden's interview that Garland inadvertently acknowledges in stubbornly withholding it. If it were nothing more than a duplicate of the transcript, it would never have been refused. The Justice Department, the Attorney General have not a leg to stand on. Their refusal is the essence of contempt. Garland's own words reflect it in the hearing before the Judiciary Committee the other day. He said certain members of this committee have marked up a contempt resolution. But as I pointed out to the Attorney General, it was a majority of the members of the committee, and he retracted those words. A majority of the committee charged by a majority of this House with inquiring into the existence of grounds to exercise the awesome constitutional power of impeachment. The Attorney General's reference to certain members reflects a political mindset that does not support withholding evidence that the committee seeks that is squarely relevant and essential to its inquiry. That defiance, the House cannot abide. Therefore, this resolution for contempt must pass this House. I yield.
Reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield a minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
Contempt. To hold something as beneath the dignity of consideration, something to be scorned, an attitude towards something that is inferior, worthless, open disrespect for something that is vile, despised, disgraced, insolence in the presence of the law. An apt description not of the subject of this motion, but of those who bring it. Not of an Attorney General who has upheld our justice system, who has demonstrated a respect for our institutions, but of those who mock the idea that we are a nation of laws, not the individual. When Republicans line up in front of a Manhattan courthouse to denigrate the rule of law in the service of a now convicted felon, that is contemptuous. When Republicans peddle the lie that Joe Biden is pulling the levers of Trump's Manhattan prosecution, that is contemptuous. When Republican committee chairmen ignore their own subpoena but feign indignation when the Attorney General complies with his, that is contemptuous. That is deserving of our scorn. That is beneath the dignity of this body. That is vile, disgraceful, and worthy. I have additional 30 seconds? That is deserving of our scorn. That is beneath the dignity of this body. That is vile, disgraceful, and worthy of derision. Those who bring this motion bring contempt, all right, but only upon themselves. I yield back.
Reserve. Gentleman from New York reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I would yield 3 minutes to myself.
So recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in American history, a presidential administration is trying to jail its opponent. And not just any opponent, but a former president of the United States. To pursue this objective, Mr. Biden's Attorney General approved an unprecedented armed raid on a former president's home, despite strenuous objections by his career officials and the local field office that normally would have had jurisdiction. He then created a new position without the constitutional requirement of congressional action or Senate confirmation. He filled that position with one Jack Smith, despite the central role Smith had played in the IRS scandal that targeted and harassed Tea Party volunteers, and despite a long history of prosecutorial misconduct. The cooked-up charge was the mishandling of classified documents. Well, shortly thereafter, we discovered that as vice president, Joe Biden had done the same thing. Yet, as president, Mr. Trump had absolute authority to declassify materials at will. As vice president, Joe Biden did not. As president, Mr. Trump had absolute authority to determine what records to keep upon leaving office. As vice president, Joe Biden did not. Yet, the Biden administration's appointed special counsel in the Biden case concluded that although Biden had, quote, willfully retained and disclosed classified materials when he was a private citizen, criminal charges were not warranted because he's, quote, a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Well, the principal justification for this glaring double standard in the handling of these two cases was the interview with Mr. Biden. Yet all we have is the unverified transcript to determine the validity of this otherwise inexplicable decision. Mr. Biden cannot claim executive privilege. This was not a policy discussion, and he's already released the transcript. But it is vital that our committee know if the transcript is complete and whether it accurately portrays the circumstances under which that decision was made. 2 Trump officials have been sentenced to prison for their failure to honor congressional subpoenas. And that case was far weaker than this one because at the time, Congress was not exercising oversight or considering legislation. In this case, the Judiciary Committee is doing both. Yet once again, we have this glaring legal double standard at play. Now, I expect the Attorney General to thumb his nose at the citation. We've come to expect that of him. But the House Judiciary Committee is charged with defending and upholding the rule of law and its fundamental principle of equal justice under law. And if we're going to restore them, this resolution is an indispensable step that we must take today. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of the time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman just attacked Special Counsel Smith. This dangerous attempt to demonize anybody who would hold Donald Trump accountable for his actions is despicable, and it is a full-out assault on the basic tenets of our democracy. I want to remind my colleagues that these types of actions have consequences. They affect the lives of many men and women who have dedicated themselves to public service and upholding the rule of law. I will submit for the record a June 11, 2024 article in the Washington Post by the Honorable Merrick Garland entitled, "Unfounded Attacks on the Justice Department Must End." It is absurd and dangerous that public servants, many of whom risk their lives every day, are being threatened for simply doing their jobs and adhering to the principles that have long guided the Justice Department's work. I would also remind my friend on the other side of the aisle that the conviction of Mr. Trump was in a state court in New York, having nothing to do with the federal government. And I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Before recognizing the gentleman, members are still reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president or toward the presumptive nominee. The gentleman is recognized.
This is not about the contempt of the Attorney General. It's about MAGA Republicans' contempt for the Constitution, the rule of law, and democracy. And it's about who any of us came here to fight for. MAGA Republicans are fighting for one person at the cost of what your constituents actually care about. You're fighting for a felon. You're fighting for a felon. On this side, we're fighting for working people. We're fighting for the kids and the teachers and the soldiers and the cops and the firefighters and the bakers and the butchers, people who go to work every day and count on us to do something for them. And you're working for a felon. A felon. 12 of his neighbors, people in the community where he committed crimes, made 34 decisions, and 408 straight times they said guilty. So let me make it clear where we stand. We will choose families over felons, verdicts over vengeance, and people over politics. And will the ranking member yield me 1 more minute?
An additional minute.
And can we also just talk about subpoenas for 1 second? Because 2 of your last speakers are 750-plus days in defiance of a subpoena. So get real when Mr. Jordan and Mr. Biggs come to this floor and want to talk and get all righteous about subpoenas. You start honoring your subpoenas, and we can talk about anyone else's subpoena. And I yield back.
Jeff from New York Reserves. Chair recognizes. Chair would remind members again to refrain from engaging in personalities toward presumptive nominees for the office of President and direct their remarks to the chair. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to yield 4 minutes to my colleague from California, Mr. Issa.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. I'm not going to refer to the current president or the presumptive nominee. I am going to refer for my colleagues, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to refer to the history of this body, because I think the study of the history of this body should tell members on both sides of the aisle that this is an appropriate contempt. It will lead eventually to compliance and, again, to holding this body as a co-equal of government. I might remind my colleagues, some of them here in the room, Mr. Speaker, that in 2007, this body held the White House counsel on behalf of the President of the United States, then President Bush, in contempt for refusing to show up before this very committee, Judiciary. In 2012, this body held a previous Attorney General in a very similar situation affecting the same 2 committees that have been speaking here, Oversight and Judiciary, held Eric Holder in contempt because he told us that if we would take 200 and some documents, and that was all that was left, and end our case, he would give them to us. Otherwise, he would withhold them. We held him in contempt. And Judge Amy Berman Jackson, an appointee of President Obama, held several things, including that President Obama had clearly falsely claimed an executive privilege, probably based on being misled by then Eric Holder, the Attorney General. And in fact, 10,000 plus documents were turned over to the United States Congress. The then Attorney General had lied. The then Attorney General, Eric Holder, had lied to this body and to the chairman of the committee, and ultimately was held in contempt on a bipartisan basis with 12 members of the other party voting for that contempt. And after a long period of time, we managed to get the equilibrium this body deserves. I call, Mr. Speaker, on this body and all my colleagues today to live up to the standard that we learned in 2007 when a White House, then of a Republican, refused to deliver a witness. Then in 2012, when the Attorney General claimed that we were not entitled to the best documents we sought, we were entitled to the documents related to Fast and Furious that he believed were appropriate. He failed, and he failed based on a judge appointed by then President Obama. Why? Because this body does have the obligation and the right to seek all of the best evidence it believes, not that the other side believes, it believes. There's been no call for an in-camera review, no call for any kind of compromise. Once again, we're to take the word of an Attorney General working for the current president that there's nothing there. I watch a lot of television over the years. I am not going to believe these are not the droids we're looking for. This, in fact, could be important evidence. Whether it is or isn't germane. What is important is that this body live up to, in fact, its obligation. And I call on every member, those on the other side who did or didn't join with me in 2012, but who voted in 2007 to hold the White House in contempt, to consider whether, once again, we're balancing the power and the right of this body. And many are arguing against the best interest of the United States House of Representatives. And for that, Mr. Speaker, shame on those who do. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This contempt vote is MAGA Republicans' desperate attempt to save face following their many failed investigations, including the one about Hunter Biden's laptop. Y'all remember that? They promised Trump and the American people that they would impeach President Biden, but after spending more than $20 million investigating conspiracy theories, MAGA Republicans have nothing to show for it. This do-nothing Congress can't pass legislation to help the American people and also can't prove any wrongdoing by President Biden. They're running out of time and they are desperate. Plus, their own presidential candidate, Donald Trump, just became a convicted felon according to a jury of his peers. So MAGA Republicans are trying to shift the blame to someone else. Even though the Justice Department produced more than 92,000 pages of documents and made dozens of witnesses available, Republicans have made Attorney General Garland their scapegoat. This is a farce, and the American people can see right through it. And with that, I yield back.
The chair would remind members to refrain from engaging in personalities toward presumptive nominees for the office of president. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to my colleague and neighbor from California, Mr. Kiley.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is a textbook example of the executive branch obstructing the oversight function of Congress. The committees of jurisdiction here have clearly set forth the legal basis for compelling disclosure of President Biden's interviews with Special Counsel Hur. Now, the administration has agreed with us inasmuch as they have produced the transcripts of those recordings. However, they have grasped wildly for some basis on which to withhold the recordings themselves. And most telling is that they've given contradictory reasons for doing so. At first, they said they weren't going to hand over the recordings because they were cumulative of the transcripts, meaning they were so similar to the transcripts that we didn't need them. But then later, they've argued that, in fact, they are so different from the transcripts that one is privileged and the other is not. When you have self-contradictory arguments being made, that is a sign that the true purpose here is obstruction. But perhaps the most absurd argument we've heard is the supposed interest asserted by the administration for withholding the recordings, that disclosing them might discourage witnesses from cooperating in future high-profile investigations. In this case, the president is not merely a witness. He is the target of an investigation by his own administration. And by the way, Special Counsel Hur testified before our committee that based on that investigation, a reasonable juror could have voted to convict President Biden. So what is the administration arguing the interest here is? That if it's somewhere down the line, there might be another president who is subject to an investigation by his own administration. And the argument goes that if that president knows that the transcript will be released, he'll sit for the interview. But if he knows there's a chance the recording might be released, he won't cooperate. This is an absurd proposition, Mr. Speaker, certainly not sufficient to override the legitimate oversight interests of the House of Representatives. Frankly, this is not how we would like to be spending floor time, but the recalcitrance and obstruction of this administration has made it necessary. I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I reserve.
Fellow from California reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from New York. Mr. Speaker, this contempt resolution is the latest attempt to tear down our democracy. The Department of Justice has cooperated with congressional Republicans at every turn. But after 92,000 pages of documents, more than a dozen transcribed interviews, and a 250-page transcript that was verified, my colleagues still aren't satisfied. They are doing this in service of one man, the disgraced former president, in a misguided attempt to distract from his crimes. On May 30th, a jury of stranger citizens found Mr. Trump guilty of 34 felony charges. It is beyond disheartening that a former president and now potential presidential candidate again was convicted of coordinating a, quote, unlawful conspiracy to win in the 2016 election and falsifying records to cover his tryst with an adult porn star. I'm grateful that the rule of law prevailed, yet I am deeply concerned that our democratic institutions are under threat. Some of these attacks coming from within. Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan said a kangaroo court convicted President Trump. Speaker Johnson called the trial a purely political exercise. Mr. Trump apparently pities himself as a so-called political prisoner. All this to tear down our Americans' faith in the rule of law. Contrary to his complaints, Mr. Trump was tried and treated fairly. Justice was served in a courtroom that was open and filled with reporters, and a jury that was chosen by the prosecution and the defense. This is the rule of law at work. Political rhetoric and deliberate misinformation, the likes of these and dangerous many others, erode faith in our institutions and threaten the safety of the American people. These attacks undermine the rule of law, which stands to protect the rights of all people. When Attorney General Merrick Garland was before the Judiciary Committee,
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. When Attorney General was before the Judiciary Committee, he described his career upholding the rule of law. In his own words, that meant ensuring that, quote, we treat like cases alike, that we do not have enemies or friends, that we do not pay attention to the political parties or the wealth or the power or the influence of the people we are investigating, that we follow the facts and the law. This is what distinguishes America from our adversaries. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
The gentleman from New York has 8.5 minutes. The gentleman from California has 6.5 minutes.
Thank you. I reserve.
Chair again will remind members to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the presumptive nominees for the office of President. The gentleman from New York reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from California. I thank the Speaker. Listen to my colleagues discussing the rule of law. I find it shocking because the average American is looking across their country and wondering what happened to the rule of law. When I watch my fellow Texans getting destroyed by dangerous cartels and individuals being allowed into the United States, terrorists, people moving fentanyl into the communities that killed 6 kids in the school district in which I live. That's happening every single day. When I watch a 75-year-old woman being put in prison by a politically motivated judge in the District of Columbia because she protested in front of an abortion clinic. I want to say that again. This Department of Justice is putting a 75-year-old woman in jail for 2 years who is dealing with physical infirmities because she was praying and protesting in front of an abortion clinic. That is astounding. That is what has happened to the rule of law. The American people watching while statues are being defaced in the name of being pro-Palestinian, people exercising their so-called free speech rights to be advancing the cause of terrorism against our friends in Israel, all happening right here, mere feet from the White House. The American people are wondering how this world got turned upside down. And here we sit and we're debating this issue. And the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, came before the House Judiciary Committee just a little over a week ago. And in that hearing, a number of questions were asked. And I engaged with the Attorney General. And I asked the Attorney General, did he or did he not claim privilege with respect to the transcripts of the audio recording in question when we were talking about Special Counsel Hur looking into the allegations of the abuse of classified materials by the President of the United States before he was president. And I asked him, and he said, no, we did not claim executive privilege with respect to the transcripts. In a separate exchange involving the best evidence rule, the Attorney General was engaging with another colleague, a friend on the Judiciary Committee, about the best evidence rule, and in doing so, articulated and explained how the transcript was admissible under the best evidence rule, which is correct. But in doing so, he kind of gave up the game, in which he described and said, they're the same. He said to the committee, he said, they're the same. Now, he just told me that they did not claim executive privilege with respect to the transcript. Then he said to all of us, they're the same. The audio recording and the transcript are the same. And then he proceeds to say that he must, in defending the rule of law, claim executive privilege on the actual audio, and then deny the members of Congress the ability, in the middle of an impeachment inquiry, duly constituted, voted on by this body on the House floor, an impeachment inquiry, to then deny us the ability to listen to the audio. The fact of the matter is, there's only one reason why the Attorney General would do that. He doesn't want us to hear it. That's why. And there's really only two reasons why that would be the case. Either the transcript doesn't match the audio, or the audio is so bad that he doesn't want us to hear it because Special Counsel Hur put the entirety of his decision not to prosecute, not to pursue, not to go after the President of the United States for abuse of classified materials. He did it entirely on the basis of what we perceive as the demeanor of the President, which only the audio can allow Congress the ability to determine the validity of that determination by the special counsel. I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Vermont, Ms. Ballant.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we're here today because of the Republican Party's unrelenting effort to get Donald Trump back into office. No matter the facts, no matter the law, for over a year, the Judiciary Committee Republican colleagues have desperately sought evidence for wrongdoing by President Biden. And what have they found? Nothing. Nothing. I'm sure it was disappointing for my Republican colleagues when Special Counsel Hur cleared the president instead of indicting him. But it is time to move on. We should be on the floor moving gun violence legislation, protecting the right to abortion, protecting the LGBTQ Americans across the country who are attacked relentlessly by my colleagues on the other side. This is a colossal waste of time, but more importantly, it is dangerous. What they are doing is dangerous. When this Congress is over, the only achievements my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will be able to point to will be the things that we, as Democrats, help them to pass. 30
Speaker,
seconds.
I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Gentlelady is recognized.
It is my job, it is all of our jobs to represent the constituents. I thought that's what we were all here for. I implore my Republican colleagues to stop putting the interests of one man above the interests of Americans. The truth will out, and history will not look kindly on what you have done here. I yield back.
To direct the remarks to the chair.
Again, nobody else?
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm ready to close when the gentleman from New York is exhausted as speakers.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank my friend. Mr. Speaker, if he gave true serum to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I'm pretty sure they would admit they'd rather not be here today doing this. They'd admit that Attorney General Merrick Garland is collateral damage for a failed effort to impeach the President of the United States. There's no honor in this, and my colleagues are, for the most part, I think, honorable people. So this is not something they want to do, but it's demanded of them nonetheless. Former President Trump has repeatedly threatened the House Republican Conference that they must impeach President Biden, quote, or else, unquote. So here we are, finding the Attorney General in contempt for providing a transcript, a full transcript, but not an audio recording of an interview from an investigation that ended up finding nothing. Oh, and by the way, the recording in question is now subject to executive privilege. So the fight's not even with the Attorney General of the United States, it's with the White House. I take some solace in the fact that many of my Republican friends and colleagues are here doing the dirty work of one individual against their will and better judgment. I know deep down, very deep down, they'd rather do the honorable thing and give up this miscarriage of justice today. I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from New York reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I'm ready to close when the gentleman's finished.
I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, House Republicans have spent the last 18 months in a futile effort to dig up dirt on President Biden, which has culminated in their epic failure of an impeachment inquiry. This resolution is nothing more than a desperate attempt to save face with the magosphere. They seek to hold the Attorney General in contempt, even though he has already turned over all the underlying information they requested in their subpoena. This resolution will not change that fact. But facts have never been the animating force behind their investigations. It is a show, and apparently the show must go on, even though the script hasn't turned out the way they wanted. But the reviews are in, and it's a flop. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this resolution and to put an end to this farce. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the American justice system is the pride of our nation. It's the envy of the world. And its central principle is the equal application of justice under law. This is why justice is depicted as blindfolded. It doesn't matter who comes before it. All are to be treated equally. It is this central principle that gives the law its legitimacy. Without it, the law becomes raw force, devoid of legitimacy. The respect for the law gives way to the law of the jungle. This is the well-trodden path that many nations before us have taken to despotism and ruin. It's the responsibility of the House Judiciary Committee to protect the rule of law and its equal application. It is our responsibility to guard our nation against the convulsions that have commonly afflicted banana republics whenever a ruling party tries to jail its opponents. The radically different handling of the documents cases involving Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden should ring alarm bells in every corner of the land. The principal justification for this radical, unequal application of law is the interview that the Judiciary Committee seeks through ancient constitutional prerogatives. It is vital that we understand the whole context of this decision, to verify the accuracy of the transcript, and to determine the extent that this conversation informed a decision that strikes at the heart not only of our rule of law, but the right of the American people to guide their own destiny through fair, free, and unfettered elections. Congress has a constitutional right and a constitutional duty to seek this information, and the Attorney General has a legal obligation to provide it, an obligation he refuses to honor. This Congress has enforced this prerogative in past cases under far less demanding circumstances than these. In order to assure that we have discharged our responsibilities, we have to compel the Attorney General to discharge his, and that's what this citation seeks to do. I urge its adoption and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 1287, the previous question is ordered on the resolution. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of House Resolution 1292 is postponed.